crowning of the thorns comes next. Right, we read about that in the gospel, but is it discernible on the shroud? Yes, but not as we see it in so many churches. Let's see. Here we've got a beautiful braid, and this is typical. It's enshrined in our tradition, right? A wreath is how he wore the crown, right? The top of the head was exposed to the open air. Yeah, that's our tradition, but the shroud dares to deviate from the norm that is so normative, that is so everywhere attested. See, we see it like this, a circlet, a ring, but on the shroud it's not a wreath, it's a cap, it's a helmet. The whole of the head is covered in thorn. We have some 30 to 50 puncture wounds here at the back of the head. That's a reconstruction of the crown. It's interesting to note that in the Bible, in Exodus, it's the priest, not only the king, but the priest who wears a crown. And it's described, there's even a plate at the forehead that says, Kadosh Ladonai, in Hebrew, holy unto the Lord, right? And so it's a helmet. If you go to the Holy Land today and go to museums where they have the accoutrements of the temple and the apparel for the priest, they have a reconstruction of a crown. Guess what it looks like? A hat, not a ring. Because a Stephanos, that's the Greek word that translates the Hebrew term, that we find in the Old Testament and in the New. Jesus' crown, in other words, is understandable. It aligns with what we know from the literature and from the archaeology of the first century, Second Temple Judaism. And yet it's unlike what a medieval forger would likely paint. Can you imagine if you're a forger, you're like, ooh, I've got an idea. I want to convince them that this is the shroud of Jesus, the burial shroud of Jesus, and yet I'm going to paint it in a way they've never seen before. That'll convince them. No, you wouldn't do that. This is why I think the shroud is authentic. This accumulation of blood, look, there's a high concentration of blood vessels at the top of the head. There's a large pooling effect here at the nape of the neck. There, I've zoomed in. This is complex. Look, the body is in the supine position. It's lying flat, like on a table. But these blood flows bear evidence of when he was in the vertical position, hanging his head on the cross. See how the blood flows down and towards the center? This is what's attested here. But on the front of the head, we see blood flows that come here at the temple. See how it's long and straight, kind of narrow blood flow here? That's arterial blood. This, however, at the front of the forehead is from the frontal vein. Today we can distinguish venous blood from arterial blood, and we know the subtleties, the musculature around an artery as it's differentiated from a vein, but not in the 1200s. And so this is most likely just an anatomically perfect representation of a blood flow. This is some of the hardest things to paint. When painters do blood flows, look for yourself at so many crucifixes. They're usually very pretty blood flows, little drips that look nice, but they're not realistic. Again and again, the shroud gets it exactly right. The forensic doctors tell us that this is some of the strongest evidence that it covered a real body that suffered. But what a suffering it is. Before I press on to the Via Crucis, I want to pause because I think I promised that I would look with the eyes of a scientist, but also to the scripture with the eyes of a pilgrim. And this is what we have to do, and yet we've done so little of. What does it mean that Christ wore a crown? What do you guys think about when you look to it? I mean, there are so many things we might say, but I think we're helped here by the opening lines of Genesis, because that's where thorns debut, but not in chapters 1 and 2. Do you remember when the Garden of Eden is described, and there's trees that have fruit that are good to eat? Every kind of fruit is there. There are no thorns or thistles until the original sin. But when Adam disobeys God, the Lord shows up to say, because you have listened to your wife, that's the beginning of the problem. No, I'm just joking. Just keeping you awake, and me too. Because you've listened to your wife and eaten of that fruit of which I said, thou shalt not eat of it, Cursed be the ground because of you. Thorns and thistles shall it bear forth, and only by the sweat of your brow will you get bread to eat. This is the language that points forward to the second Adam, right? But the first Adam is the one who brings thorns, or better, thorns and thistles into the equation. This is the shape of the cosmic curse that lays over all the earth. Go figure that thorns and thistles are a symbol of sin, and thorns and thistles are what's going to be on the head of Jesus. It's also going to be on his lips in his first homily. Do you remember the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 7? Jesus says, "Beware of false prophets. They are like ravenous wolves in sheep's clothing, but you'll know them by their fruit. Are grapes gathered from thorns or figs from thistles?" The exact same vocabulary as appeared in Genesis. Go figure, Jesus knew his Bible. He knew that thorns were a symbol of sin, just as he knew that he'd be crowned with thorns. And so by the mere gesture of wearing that crown of thorn upon his head, what he's saying is, I'm the sin bearer, the one who takes away the sins of the world. Isn't that what John the Baptist would proclaim on day one, on page 1 of John's Gospel? The prophet would say, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." But that language, the Lamb of God, that's a strange thing. Why is he calling a person a lamb? Again, the scriptures decipher the code. Genesis 22, a passage we were just talking about in the car on the ride over. The Akedah, the binding of Isaac. I love this. This is so deep. Abram gets renamed. He used to be the exalted father. God says, that's not good enough for you. You're going to be called Avraham, father of a multitude. That's hilarious. You've got one kid, Abraham. His name is Isaac. Yeah, I want you to offer that one kid as a holocaust on a mountain that I'll designate to you on the third day. He doesn't understand, but he says amen anyway, goes marching, gets to the foot of the mountain, says to the servant standing by, y'all stay here, we're going to go up and worship, and we will come back to you. You're going to offer him up as a holocaust. The book of Hebrews explains he believed that God could raise him from the dead. It doesn't say that in Genesis, but that's an interesting reading. As they're going up the mountain, look at this. The only beloved son is carrying the wood of the sacrifice up the mountain of the sacrifice, Mount Moriah. And he says, hey, Dad, here's the wood. Where's the lamb? Can you imagine what goes through the mind of the father in moments like this? Hate to tell you there, kid, but no, what does he say instead? Prophetically, our Father in faith. God will provide the lamb. But does he? Keep reading. He doesn't. Not on that day. As you keep reading, it's the angel that shows up just in the nick of the time. Talk about a test, right? Whew, just in the last moment, he stays the hand of Abraham and says, now that I know that you truly believe, that you fear God, do no harm to the boy. By the way, I have to pause to mention, how old is Abraham? Abraham is what, pushing 100? His son? Well, he's not 4 years old if he's carrying the wood up the mountain. Ask the Jews today. According to the rabbinical tradition, he's in his 30s. Interesting. They call it the Akedah, the binding, because they imagine Isaac to be, get this, a willing victim after his father explained the message received, the revelation from on high. If that doesn't rhyme with Jesus, but what else rhymes with an event 2,000 years in the future? It's not just the only beloved son who is spared, who rhymes with the only beloved son, Jesus, who is not spared. Romans 8 makes exactly that connection. But what does he see, Isaac, as he spins around after the angel shows up? Do you remember what he sees? A ram. Very good. It's not a lamb that was promised, but a ram is what's provided on that day, with its horns wrapped in a thicket. Its head is wrapped in thorn. And this will be the vicarious victim that dies instead of the only beloved son. Here you need to know a little Hebrew. The word for horn, guess what? It's the same word for might, for power. Doesn't that make sense? Because if you're going to charge, if you're going to attack, and you're a ram, what do? Horns forward, full speed ahead, right? If you're being attacked, how do you defend yourself? With your horns, horn against horn, might against might. Think now, at the foot of the cross, what are they saying? Jesus, you saved others, save yourself. Come down and we'll believe in you. That's like, you showed might in the past, do it again and we'll believe. In other words, Jesus, you claim to have divine muscle, flex, right? Jesus saying, you want to see power? I'll show you power. I'll die and on the third day rise, just as I said I would. But for the time being, my might, my horns, wrapped in a thicket. That is to say, give me your best shot. I won't dodge the bullet. I'll take the blow. I will descend all the way down into Hades. I'll descend into death. But from that dark place, light shines. And when it shines, what is he saying? It's almost like, that's it? That's all you got? Can you see him taunting his enemies? Like, they've concentrated all their power on one point, spent all their strength just to get Jesus into Sheol. But he can't stay there, because he's the author of life. I am the resurrection and the life. John 11:25. And he shows it in the new creation. This is what we must see when we look to the crown of thorns. Jesus is putting on display divine authority and power. Earthly kings, Gentile lords, lorded over their subjects. They're the one in fancy thrones with gold crowns. Jesus is redefining leadership, reimagining the kingdom. And with vis-a-vis our expectations, it's upside down. But we're the ones who are upside down. Jesus is telling us what paradoxical lordship looks like. And so it's appropriate that it's a crown, but a crown of thorns. Jesus is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. But what a different kingdom he puts on display. I'm taking too much time, so I'm going to press on and be more brief. Jesus carries the cross, yes, but it's not a T cross that weighs over 325 pounds. The expectation was this. Instead, the shroud gives us a patibulum, that is, a horizontal beam that sits on the shoulders. Look, there's the excoriation on the right shoulder and on the left shoulder blade. Men who work on the railroad carry big beams in just exactly this way. It seems, I guess, Jesus was right-handed, by the way, carrying a third of the weight in front of him, 2/3 behind. He falls, he jostles his position, loses his balance. It abrades the portion of the body that sticks out on the opposite side. The scapular sits right there, anatomically perfect. Look, Jesus likely didn't have his hands free, especially if he is in a chain gang. Do you remember how he's crucified with a man on his left and on his right? It's likely, we don't know, but that there were cords or fetters of some kind. You couldn't just drop your crossbeam and run off to freedom in the middle of the city streets. Maybe you were bound to the people by your side. If that's the case, you fall, you come crashing down to your knees and then to your face. Do you know that we find soil on the shroud? And it's on the feet, of course, but not only, it's on the left knee and, I'm sad to say, at the tip of the nose. He did a face plant, it seems. And 100 pounds, give or take 25, or do you use kilograms here? 57 to 75 kilograms, I think it is, that comes crashing down on a crown of thorns, 3/4 of an inch long, those thorns, and they might be supple when the plant is green, but then they oxidize and become hard as nails. According to the forensic doctors, they don't press just through the skin, but all the way to the bony plate below. If that were me, friends, I'd just stay on the ground. I'd be like, I'm done. But what are you looking forward to anyway? Like, to get to the cross? This is how we have to see divine love on display. He gets up. What's driving him to do so? Love. Love. And so when he is brought to now the place of Golgotha, you know that the word means Calvarium. In Latin, the place of the skull, right, because it's the traditional execution site. Maybe it bears that name because it's littered with skulls, literally. If that's the case, it's likely that the same pieces of wood were used and reused. In other words, there's a fixture in the vertical piece that's already planted in the ground. It's ready to receive the horizontal beam that the man is carrying, according to the first century literature, right? But it has pre-established holes on either side. So when you bring the victim to the execution site, all you do is grab a 9-inch nail with a square cross section and drive it through the wrists. Once the hole lines up, or the wrist lines with the hole that's already in the patibulum. The bad news is that the place of the wound is in the wrist. It's in the carpals. If you want to find the spot, just put your pinky and thumb together, bend all the way down, and see under the flexed muscle in your thumb, there's a little thinner furrow right here, right under that muscle, adjacent to that central sinew here at the forearm. That's the place where the point of the nail goes in, it seems, because it exits out, look, 1.5 centimeters higher on the opposite side, precisely where the median nerve and ulnar nerve pass through. This is going to send shock waves of excruciating pain through the central nervous system, exploding in the brain for the 4.5 hours that Jesus is on the cross, give or take an hour and a half. Can you imagine? And I chose those words precisely, by the way. Did you ever pause to think about the word excruciating? Do you know that the root is crux, crucis, the cross, the one crucified? This is what they're aiming at, to torture the victim in the most brutal way imaginable. There were men who didn't get morphine when they had an exposed median nerve in World War II. Some preferred to commit suicide than to endure the pain. This is what Jesus willingly steps into. So what do they do when they got to get the nail in the other hand on the other side? Well, they just stretch it out into little lines with the hole that's already there. What if it doesn't reach? You make it reach. You dislocate the shoulder and then drive in the nail. If you know Padre Pio, again, this is private revelation, and so take it with a grain of salt if you like, but he says that the shoulder was the most painful part of the Passion. The shoulder, and I can imagine, right? Because, look, just try to hold your hands above your head for 5 minutes. Nobody's beating you up, but it's unbearable. You can't even swat away a fly. That's the beginning of it. If you've carried the cross on that shoulder and now dislocated and now you're hanging from the cross, look at what this implies. At a certain moment, and we seldom think about this, Jesus is made to stand up. All the way to the wood, where does it go? On those 2 nails in the hands. You can't even lean forward if you've got a crown of thorns on your head. And so it's not until these 2 men lift him up just a few inches off the ground, that's enough. No need to put him 30 feet in the air like some movies represent the fact. All right, we know this, by the way, from the shroud, because the pierced side is that of a lance, right? But the lance doesn't come rushing in at an oblique angle as if he was high above our heads. He's almost at eye level, just a few inches above. Okay, so that makes sense. That would be the easy way to do it. And we know that the Romans did it and did it well, efficaciously and easily, again and again. Do you know that along the Via Appia, that stretch of road that goes from Rome to Bari, 6,000 people were crucified? They knew how to do it and to do it in a smart way. There's no way, by the way, that they put the nails where we imagined them. See how, isn't it true that they're almost always in the center of the palms? Museums, paintings, everywhere. That's what we imagined. But guess what? An experiment was done. Sorry for the morbid detail here, but it's pedagogical. On fresh cadavers done by a French surgeon by the name of Pierre Barbet, he proves that with just half the weight of a human body, if the nails are in the center of the palms, because this is just soft tissue and there's no transversal support, after 10 minutes, the nail just comes ripping right through. And so there's no way that a con artist would obviously paint the nails there. That wouldn't work to hold the weight of the body, not even half the weight of a human body. And yet, if the nail is where the shroud depicts it, In the carpals, namely in disto space or Z space, you could last 2 weeks and not fall down. Sometimes they come and feed you. Sometimes they give you a little sedile, a little seat to protract your sufferings. Crows sometimes would come and peck out the eyes of the victim. Do you remember that detail from the Passion of the Christ? There's literature that suggests that took place. In Jesus' case, look, he died so quickly. That was not the norm. That should tell us something about the intensity of the sufferings prior to his getting there. Do you remember how Pilate said, what? He's already dead? You want his body now? Make sure he's dead. They pierce his side. They take him down in the matter of a few hours. That means that Jesus was brutally tortured before he was ever nailed to the cross. But now they lift him up and they put 2 nails in his hands. And now you see this blood flow. In fact, there are 2. That's surprising. Who thought of that? Doesn't blood just trickle down from its source? Straight down, according to gravity. Yeah, so why are there 2 blood flows? Does gravity change and just flow off to the side? No, he's rotating. He's rotating around his wrist. Imagine what this implies. He's in a low position. Remember, on the ground he was 90 degrees with his arms outstretched like this. They lift him up, he sags 25 degrees. All the weight of his body hanging on the nails in his hands. He can't breathe like this. Because look, I'll exaggerate for a second. When you breathe in, and then breathe out. See how that's easy to do as I bring my hands low? But if they're fixed high, you stretch out the intercostal muscles that regulate the respiration, right? When you inhale, and then you exhale, you relax. But you can't do that when your arms are stretched and forced in this position. The best you can do is the next best thing. You press down on the nails in your feet. Look, that's where the nail is. 1 nail, it seems, goes through both feet because we see the toes on 1 foot only. The other toes are overlapping, it seems, because we see the heel, but not the toes. And so, look how he's in a high position and a low position. A high and a low. And that's what explains this bifurcation pattern of 5 to 7 degrees. This is extremely complex. Look, the body is lying flat on a surface like a table. But it bears witness to when he was hanging on the cross. And he was low and high, as you see here in the slide. This is the agony that he's in for 3 to 6 hours. He can't even breathe. And he's speaking from the shroud, from the cross. I wouldn't have whispered a word if that were me. But he's praying for us in his torture. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Read the original Greek, and do you know how that line is introduced? This is surprising. It doesn't say, he said, in the simple past. It says instead, he was saying, elegen. It means it's a repetitive action, like a refrain in a song that you come back to. Father, forgive them. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. As he's in agony, he's praying for the people that are torturing him. Tell me if that's not divine love, right? Jesus would speak 7 times, into your hands I commend my spirit. He would say to the thief standing by, look at this, he's consoling someone else. Today you will be with me in paradise. And then Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Look at that. He's quoting the Psalms. Can you imagine the concentration? How has he assimilated the scriptures so deeply that he can pray the Psalms when I can't even pray a Hail Mary when I've got a toothache, right? So it should awaken in us in a devotion to what Jesus is enduring. But then he lets out a loud cry, tetelestai, right? Consummatum est. It is finished. He breathes his last, and he dies. Does he, though? I mean, yeah, that's what Christians say. Do you know what our Muslim brothers would say? Jesus, no, he didn't die. He was brought to the brink of death and then nursed back to health. That's a theory that was popular for a time. It's called the swoon theory. It's easier to explain. Don't go thinking about a resurrection. He was on the brink of death, and then we nursed him back to health. You Christians invented that bit about resurrections, miracles, etc. Is it the case? Look to the shroud. This wound at the side means this man certainly died, because a lance with a cross-section of 4 centimeters penetrates between the 5th and 6th rib on the right side, a distance of just 3.5 inches, or 10 centimeters to the heart. Here's a fascinating statue that's in Rome at a famous museum called the Capitoline Hill, on the Capitoline Museums. It's called the Dying Gaul because this soldier, mind you, this is from the 3rd century before Christ, and it shows that he's received a wound from a Roman lancea, a spear. See how he has between the 5th and 6th rib? From where you're sitting, maybe you can't see it, but the wound is in exactly the same spot, with the exact same dimensions, a kind of double-edged blade that gives an oval shape that we'll see exactly on the shroud. This man is contemplating his imminent death within 2 to 3 minutes. If you don't have a traumatic surgeon standing by and you've received a blow like this one, you are dead. In Jesus' case, do you remember? He's already dead. Usually, they'd apply what's called crurifragium. They'd break the knees, they'd break the legs. Right now, you can't press down. Now you can't rise up and breathe. And so you asphyxiate more quickly if your legs are broken. Jesus is like that Paschal lamb. Not a bone shall be broken. But he is pierced. Out flows blood and water. That's what we see. Or do we? Like, I can see the blood, but I can't see the water. Not with the naked eye. But in 1978, these STURP scientists, they can see this blood flow. See how where the wound is formed right here. The blade goes in and now under pressure comes spurting out. See the splotchy stains? That's because it comes flowing out under pressure. It's what's called a pleural effusion, right? The pleura is this double membrane that envelops the lungs and hearts, and it's compressing those organs, making it more arduous for him to draw breath, more painful for his heart to pump, and then he eventually dies. And we know that he's dead because this blood stain is what's called post-mortem blood. That is to say, it's not blood that was shed during his life as the heart is beating and now everything's mixed up, all those organelles like red blood cells mixed up with the plasma. No, the heart has stopped. The red blood cells and the other heavy organelles settle to the bottom. The plasma, the serum, comes rising to the top. That separation of the watery substance from the corpulous blood at the base takes place within 30 to 60 minutes after death. So evidently, according to the gospel, Jesus had already died for 30 to 60 minutes because what comes out? Water and blood, blood and water. That's what he testifies in the written document. And that's what's seen on the shroud, but not with the naked eye. This was not seen until the modern era, until we use UV fluoroscopy to discern that in addition to the corpulous blood which you see, there's also a halo, a boundary around the margin of this blood stain. Serous blood. Plasma is there. So think of this. If this is the work of a con artist, look, he was so committed to his cause, he killed a man just so he could give us a blood stain that nobody could discern how distinct it was until 700 years beyond the Middle Ages? And so I think it's much more likely that it's just telling us the facts. Here's another detail about this blood stain that will blow your mind. The body image is not underneath the blood stain. Think just to draw the point home. If you were an artist, what would you do? Would you paint the body and then add the blood stains on top? Or would you start with blood stains and then add the body? Can you imagine if you did the latter? If you do the blood stains and then you realize, oh my gosh, my neck needs to be like a giraffe. My hand needs to be far, far away from the elbow. It wouldn't work. Obviously, you would paint the frame of the body first, and then you would add the blood on top, right? This is not the case on the shroud. The blood was there first, and it coats certain fibers, the ones touching the blood, stained corpse. And that protects those fibers as opposed to others. Those that are uncoated by blood are the ones that receive in a second moment the image of the body. At what moment is that? Look, I know this from science. The shroud is not a painting, a rubbing, a scorch, or a photograph. It's not the natural effect of a natural event that anyone can name. So might it be, to use the logic of Sherlock Holmes, do you remember how he says this? Once you've eliminated all that's impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, is most certainly true. Well, what's the other option that's on the table? If it's not a naturalistic cause, what if it's a supernatural event? What if it's the result of the resurrection? And that's the last point. And with this, I'll let you guys go home. And sorry for going long, but I've got so much to say, and I'll try to be brief. But look, the body is in rigor mortis. That is the case for only a few brief hours. The body begins to relax and then decompose. 40 hours after initiation, this decomposition should be seen. And yet, on the shroud, there are no signs of decomposition or putrefaction anywhere on the cloth. And so, if the body were continued to be in contact with the cloth, you would get a very grotesque image on the shroud. And yet, you don't. It proves that the body was separated at a very early hour, namely before the 40-hour threshold. But that's not it. It's also, is it clear this rigor mortis? Can you see how the head is raised? There's no pillow under his head. There's no triangular support under his knees. The buttocks are curved because he's like a rock. This is what happens, especially where there's a high concentration of blood, where there's been physical exertion, as it is the case on the crucifixion. So his body is like a rock. Obviously, they force his arms down, breaking rigor mortis, putting his arms in a way that they can carry him from the execution site to the burial site. But now he maintains that state. It's not like fingers, when you press them to a flat surface, they're pressed flat. The curvature in the buttocks especially shows that he's in this state. Okay, that's the first element. But the second is this. The blood stains aren't smudged or smeared. He's pasted to the envelope around him, right? Can you imagine what dried blood is? Now it's re-softening in the tomb by a process called fibrinolysis, the melting of the dried blood such that it can transfer from his body into the fibers of the cloth. That's a process that takes 30 to 36 hours. This bloodstain, evidence that fibrinolysis was interrupted 30 to 36 hours after initiation. Friends, if you do the math with me, when is Jesus laid in the tomb? It's Friday night. Before the third star in the sky appears, that's when the Sabbath rest would descend upon these law-observant Jews. And they'd be inclined to tuck the body in the tomb and then go away. And so what's 30 to 36 hours after 6 p.m.? It puts us in the window between midnight and 6 a.m. on Easter Sunday, Resurrection Sunday. Can you think of a reason why the body isn't there anymore, not in contact with the cloth, between midnight and 6 a.m.? Of course, the resurrection would accommodate the fact. And yet, even though we know there's separation, and at an early hour, there's no evidence that somebody wrenched off the cloth. Like when I take off a Band-Aid, I always count to 3, right? Because I know that on the count of 3, a little bit of me is going with that Band-Aid, right? And I can look back to the Band-Aid and see the violence that I just inflicted upon myself, right? The smudging, the smearing. Not a millimeter of displacement anywhere on these bloodstains. Suggestive that the body just became like light and passed through a window pane. I think you'll appreciate this because in our liturgies, we sometimes highlight the typologies, that is the rhymes, the events that rhyme in history. Do you remember how Jesus, baby Jesus, was wrapped in swaddling clothes? Well, Jesus, not just then, but also in the virgin tomb, is wrapped in swaddling clothes. That virgin womb of Mary remained virgin, not just before birth and not just after birth, but get this, during. Did you know that? Did you know that Mary is perpetually virgin? Even in birth, the envelope that contains him is not violently broken, but like light through a window pane, Jesus is born into our world. Well, so it seems that there's a rhyme with the way in which he's born unto glory. Or maybe we should say reborn. Isn't that the language that Jesus used with Nicodemus? You can't enter the kingdom unless you're born from above or reborn. This is Jesus, the first fruits. Where's the full harvest? In his church. Friends, when you look to the shroud and contemplate the death and resurrection of Jesus, you're contemplating your own story. This is the way we're all to go, unto glory, but not without death. This is not just the death cloth, it's the resurrection cloth. The two key mysteries of our faith in Christ are here contained. Dying, you destroyed our death, right? That's half the story. What's the other half? Rising, you restored our life. How did that image get there? If not by the resurrection. If Jesus is risen, then he's divine. So the two truths of Jesus, that he's the man, in a mortal nature that he assumed, he died a redeeming death for those of us who share his humanity. But he can't redeem us unless he's God. Well, his divinity is seen in his resurrection. If I were to ask Jesus for one photograph, because one's all I get, I'd make sure it was something pretty cool, like when he's walking on water maybe, or when he's on the Mount of Transfiguration. But the one image he deigned to give us is the one that contains the central mysteries of our Christian faith. He wanted you to have reasons to believe. Isn't that what he said in the gospel? Believe me, or else believe because of the works that I do. What's the greatest work that he does, if not the resurrection, which justifies our belief in him? This is the foundation of our Christian faith. He would tell Thomas, even though he didn't believe his friends, when they said, we saw him, he's risen. He's like, yeah, right, I will not believe unless I put my finger in his side. Jesus shows up. I love this, by the way. The doors are locked, 4 walls. That's no impediment for the glorified body of Jesus. He shows up anyway. If that's the case, can you imagine how much less is a flimsy little linen going to be a barrier for him? He can pass right through. He passed right through on the 8th day in the upper room, and he sees Thomas. Can you imagine? What would you say? Thomas, what were you saying? Right? He doesn't upbraid him. He doesn't point fingers. Instead, he says, Thomas, come. I love this. He goes to the skeptic, the doubting Thomas, and says, put your finger in my side, but don't be unbelieving, but believe. And it's the skeptic, the one who had no predisposition to believe, but when faced with a preponderance of evidence right before his eyes, what does he say? My Lord and my God. No one else in the gospel has a more direct confession in Jesus' divinity than the skeptic. That gives us reasons to believe. In other words, the evidence was so overwhelming, he couldn't but go this way. My Lord and my God. And so I just wonder if Jesus accommodated the doubts of Thomas in his day. Does he do it now? With the shroud, does he invite us to press and probe this ancient linen? But can you hear him saying, but skeptics, don't be unbelieving, but believe. Friends, you've been very patient. God bless you. I'm going to end with that.